All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, great, thanks. Well, welcome back to our 12th annual nolaILC Information Literacy Forum and the third day of our online conference. We are so glad that you're here with us today. My name is Janine Smith. I'm a member of the nolaILC Executive Board, and our chat monitor today is nolaILC Executive Board member Roxanne Guidry. So we are going to start with our land acknowledgement statement. We want to start by acknowledging the original inhabitants of this land. The city of New Orleans is a continuation of an indigenous trade hub on the Mississippi River, known for thousands of years as Bulbancha, a Choctaw term meaning place of many tongues. Native peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and the resilient voices of Native Americans remain an inseparable part of our local culture. The New Orleans Information Literacy Collective would not only like to acknowledge and honor the indigenous people of this land, but we encourage our executive board, presenters, and attendees to shift their approach to land acknowledgements and consider meaningful activities and reparative actions to support Native communities. We ask that over the course of the forum this week that you reflect and carry out an actionable item. You might consider aiding nations in recovering and controlling their rightful homelands through Native-led organizations such as the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. Support and petition on behalf of local tribes in achieving federal recognition. Many tribes in Louisiana, like the United Houma Nation and the Louisiana Band of Choctaw, have state recognition but not federal, which strengthens a tribe's fight for land sovereignty. Follow on social media and/or donate to organizations like Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women USA or the Association of American Indian Affairs Repatriation Project, which works to return ancestral remains and sacred objects to their original nations. These are just a few recommendations, but by no means do they encompass all the ways in which you can support Native communities. We encourage you to continue learning and participating as we aim to avoid performativity and work to be equitable and inclusive of all. A link to this land acknowledgement will be with a list of resources to the items mentioned above can be found in the footer of the nolaILC website, and we will provide a direct link to the list in the chat now. Okay, so before we get started, there are a few housekeeping matters to take care of. We will have two presenters today who will speak for about a half an hour each, and after we'll have questions from attendees. You can type your questions into the chat box at any time, and our chat moderator will keep track of them for the session afterwards. So you can use the chat box to let us know about any tech problems that you might think are originating on our end. And finally, in the chat box, we've dropped the URL to our link tree, which includes links to our social media channels and land acknowledgement and action statements and links. And one final note, we are recording this presentation and sharing it with registered participants on our YouTube channel, and more details at the end of the session. If you would rather not be recorded, feel free to turn off your camera function at this time. Okay, so that concludes the housekeeping matters. And today we have with us Patrick Morgan with Discovery and the Ideal of Structure and Search Queries, Advanced Search as Antidote to the Black Box Search Strategy. And after we'll have Sarah Waits discussing accessing ancestors, finding enslaved people in Sacramental records. So Patrick Morgan is the Director of Library Reference and Instruction at Centenary College of Louisiana's Miguel Library in Shreveport, where he has worked since January of 2022. Before this, he was Access Services Lead and Student Success and Outreach Librarian at Savannah State University for several years, which and has had librarian posts at Hope College and the University of the Ozarks in his 15-year library career. He's a father of 3 kids and 3 cats and an enthusiastic acoustic guitarist, a shambolic runner, and likes to identify mushrooms, bugs, and reptiles. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for attending. I'm going to share my screen in just a minute while I collect myself. So I'm so glad that there are these things to do, like navigate to the sharing your screen panel to distract yourself from being nervous, which I undoubtedly am, unaccountably. Maybe it means this is going to be awesome. Let's go with that. Anyway, hopefully you all can hear me. If you can't,
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your screen.
Fantastic. Oh, okay. So this is the real. I've been suffering from title regret. I don't know if you're familiar with this phenomenon. When you come up with a title and you like the title, and then as time draws near to make your presentation, you decide you hate the title. This is not really the name of my presentation. This is the name I gave it when I was working on it to spur myself onward and to help remind myself that it's really not that serious, because ultimately it'll be fine. But really, this is what I actually would call, if I had to do it over again today. I would probably just go with this simple title, Advanced Search and Discovery, because that's what I want to talk about. And the highlight, one of the main leitmotif here is the idea of getting beyond what I think of as a black box. And this is not original terminology for me. There's a long history of the idea of the black box, but it is quite useful for thinking about search in general. And that is one of the things that I want to do, but also the way that our patrons and even we as library professionals interact with search tools. So I want to linger for a while on search. And out of this, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to discuss some ramifications for information literacy when it comes to discovery layers, teaching them, but inflected in a couple of important ways. And I want to just sort of give you these three themes, hopefully, and I'm trying to be mindful of time. Half hour, Patrick. Hard when you have absolutely no physical cues, right? This is the age we live in. But anyway, three themes that I'm going to kind of repeatedly return to that are pretty basic, that I'm hoping that you're going to leave this at least chewing on. One is the idea of, search as an interesting concept on its own. Now you may take this as just sort of an insipid truism or something that just sounds like something a librarian would say, but I really believe that in a deep way. And I want to get into that in a little bit, but I hope at the very least you'll be on the side of search as an interesting concept on its own as a human phenomenon. Two, the idea of thinking about, yes, information literacy, and this is largely an academic library thing, maybe, but not necessarily, but the idea of libraries truly as a fully 360-degree immersive whole person outreach and development tool that can be used by their larger institutions, whether it's a community or an academic institution, to develop patrons in really robust ways. That is to say, using the full library, which is something that I'm relatively new to. One of the reasons, background, that I came to Centenary was for an opportunity to really be able to think with the entire library as a teaching tool, from the physical spaces in the library to the web presence, to the way that relationships with, in my particular case, other faculty go. But really integrating all of those things. The discovery layer is part of that. And I want to get you thinking, as you probably already do, a little bit more about the way that those things interplay. And then finally, just sort of in general, the idea of allowing ourselves to appreciate some of the useful complexity that we're confronted with on a daily basis. Which I think is a lot of what we do well in libraries, is helping people slow down, work through their process. And I'm hopeful that I'll be able to do that here. But without further ado, let me dive right into the subject matter here. So I suggested before that I wanted to linger on the idea of search. It seems like this is a good idea to defend, both from the standpoint of just it gives me a foil against which to frame a larger discussion, which it does, but also because I do think that often search is one of those, particularly in the contemporary information landscape, for lack of a better, totally all-inclusive term. It's just such a part of the fabric of the way that we go about working with information. We kind of take it for granted in the way that, someone just said this to me in a conversation, and I can't remember who it was, but I'm stealing from that person who made this David Foster Wallace reference where, you ask a fish, I'm paraphrasing badly, hey, how's the water? And the fish is like, what's water? Because it's just there. It's what's around us. Well, search is kind of like that. We can take it for granted. So anyway, but it's interesting on its own, and just as one or two examples of why that is, and if you're not routinely amazed by this, that's okay, but maybe you should be. It's very interesting that a lot of our contemporary search tools that are most sophisticated, they function as tools that they're like language bridging tools, where we take often language that winds up in one way or another, often being encoded in text, whether it originates voice or some other way. Text as sort of a medium of exchange, and then is processed by some kind of a program, an algorithm or set of algorithms to retrieve information, like what happens when you interact with almost any search engine from any vendor. And then at the same time, when you think of all the complexities that branch out of that, just the fundamental ubiquity of it. But then beyond that, consider that we're not in a situation either where, as capabilities of search change, that we're getting a smaller knowledge base. Our knowledge base only increases. The amount of searchable material grows exponentially all the time. I'm not even going to get into talking about the relative estimated sizes of what's indexable and what's not indexable on the web, because there's such old saws. But I think everyone here probably knows, just from their own experience, that there's a certain way in which almost all keyword, as necessary as keyword searching is, that routinely it kind of comes up short. There's an awful lot of sifting that's got to go in the back end of the keyword search. And part of that is a function of the way that the tools work. Part of that is a function just of the fact that we are awash in, and I know that this is commonplace, still worth bearing in mind, we're just so awash in information. So anyway, what I'm suggesting for the basis of this is that, search is just really this sort of fundamental thing that pervades our experience as information users, which is so central to being a human these days. And we have examples of enormous search tools like Google, I'm old enough to be able to remember a time when using a web, something is, I don't know, I was about to say pedestrian, but that's not really appropriate. Something is non-academic as like a Google search engine, which is weird on its face because Google grows out of an academic project, of course, but grad school me around 2001, say, I had kind of been trained to be skeptical of things that were findable on the web, but of course we know from many studies and now from our own experience that using Google is kind of a fundamental skill because of the amount of information that it indexes and how quickly and routinely that information is updated. So we know that this doesn't come without problems, right? And these are not aspects of search that I'm going to linger on today. Specifically things like, if you're familiar with the work of Sophia Noble, talking about things like inherent bias and search algorithms, or even you can probably remember different furor about the way that searches are suggested when you put it into Google, depending upon what the root of your search was. Lots of very interesting topics for discussion there, but the important thing to return to at its base is an old idea. Information scientists like Andrew Large, for example, in the 90s, were talking about, and here I'll kind of transition into one of my main ideas, the idea of a black box. You know, and specifically what I'm going to paraphrase a quote from the work of Andrew Large, Information Seeking in the Online Age, written in the 90s. So you might think different days, but the idea that I'd like to take from that is that there was a fair amount of skepticism that people in the main would be comfortable just sort of trusting a search, an information retrieval attempt, to what amounted to a black box, something whose, and defined as something whose algorithm or means of sifting through information wasn't completely understood or made transparent to the user. So the idea, and I will spend some time on this, this idea of the black box. I know I'm skipping ahead. I'll go back. It's all right. I don't want to give myself short shrift, though I do want to be mindful of time. Come on, Patrick. But you know, the idea of a black box being something whose processing is unknown to you, and yet you trust the outcome for some reason. So even back in the 90s, before we had really ubiquitous search engines that worked well, if you were an internet user in the 90s, you often, if you were savvy, would probably navigate to different sites using directories, and there wasn't really a great single search engine, because search is difficult to build, and for a variety of other reasons. But you know, now our situation is very different, of course, and I'll return a little bit more to Large's idea of the black box when I get to that slide. But what we know for sure in the academic sphere and our own personal experience, working with students and patrons, is that good search is increasingly necessary. So if keyword search isn't enough, if you know, there are enormous repositories that present dynamic content, like the Google index, which is how I refer to Google in general. Or, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, things like discovery layers, which are, you know, they aim to replicate some of that ease of access, that unity of interface, that simplicity of presentation in the way that contemporary search engines do. And I have a lot more to say about discovery layers, clearly. But the point of both of those is that in both cases, whether it's the standard way of accessing library information or information on the web, these are increasingly kind of unitary domains. And as they individually get bigger, then the utility of a single search box in the absence of a really well thought out vocabulary or set of terms is questionable. So, and then beyond that, the last reason of these different ways of thinking about why search is interesting and important for us is that there are other aspects of search that we don't often focus on, even though we probably, I know speaking from my own experience, find them to be true. So search is affective. There's an emotional component to search. It's a psychologically complex process. I have found that this is often overlooked, both in the sense that people aren't eager to talk about it or acknowledge it maybe, or it's not, you know, the kind of topic that's easy to discuss. It's hard to wrangle. Things like Well, I don't know what your background is like, but for me, growing up in my very conservative household, for example, there were topics that I was worried about getting into, or having my parents know that I was getting into, for fear, I was going to say for fear of reprisal, but of course it wasn't that serious, but fear that, I would be sanctioned in some way or castigated by my parents for having some kind of inappropriately prurient interest. And we can all think of probably situations where, depending on your context, certain kinds of information seeking behavior are frowned upon. And obviously, as with all behavior, there's a spectrum of normal and statistically unusual. I don't, but of things that fall within all kinds of different shades of what's acceptable or not acceptable before you get into questions of legality. So I'm not necessarily focusing on any of those things, but the idea that certain topics shouldn't be researched, looked up, or how do I think through a query if some of the terms that I want to use, I'm not really comfortable using myself, who's watching me make this search. And I think what that suggests, something that we often forget, is that when I do a search in the first place, I'm indicating something about myself, right? At least that is, I think, a valid way of looking at that exchange. It's sort of, in many cases now, a digital system where I'm putting words in, but those words come from me. They indicate something that I want to accomplish or know about. And in that way, they sort of invite, or the feeling of a kind of vulnerability. And those are just a few ways that search has that kind of affective component that is often easy to overlook. So from, I'm not going to get into speculative things about hypothetical students at this particular point, but you don't need, I don't think, to do a very aggressive thought experiment to imagine students with perspectives of all sorts that might have a variety of reasons for thinking that they shouldn't be looking up certain things or asking certain questions. So in the context of, as I say, using the entire library to develop the whole person, this is a real point of connection for us as teaching librarians, as aspects of a growth institution, for meeting people where they're at in terms of grappling with the information needs that they have. Part of that, really fundamental, is enabling that sense of introspection, of saying it's all right to think through certain questions that maybe I'm afraid to articulate. All of that goes into the effectiveness of search, and to me really leads into the idea of advanced search. I'm gonna do a quick time check here. Okay, so good search is important. I'm specifically focused on getting beyond keyword search. I know this is kind of an old library shibboleth. Don't just do basic keyword searching, use keywords as a way to get into something where you can identify the right controlled vocabulary, find better terms. One of the things that has changed, and here I'm going to introduce a little more aggressively than I have, the idea of discovery layers. Discovery layers, as fascinating as search is as a larger concept, the things that we call discovery layers that enable, so here, for example, and yes, I'm jumping ahead for a couple of reasons, but I will be back. I'm not going to leave myself in the dust, hopefully. This is a very pixelated, I'm so sorry, image of our discovery layer, which is just a single search here. And I'm always encouraging people to link out to the advanced search. Good grief, which looks something like this. Okay, this is a standard advanced search breakdown. And I'll go back to the slide in a minute, but what I really wanted to be able to refer to, and I needed this visual, was, you know, those three islands, those empty fields. And it's nice to be able to think, and I will hopefully have time to return to this idea of going through and thinking about how different fields combine with one another. But you know, part of the benefit of advanced search, and I think of leaning on discovery layers more seriously for instruction, is that they provide a single interface where you can really focus the way that you are framing your query right from the beginning. And to me, even just the simple existence of multiple fields that you can add, and of course you can get rid of them, it prompts the right kind of reflection, I think, for the way that a good search works. Because you can see I've got my little Venn diagram here down on the right. Oh, let me move my panel out of the way here, slide us over. So I refer to this simple Venn diagram all the time in talking about the value of advanced search, that, you know, when you take two ideas that are themselves distinct and you combine them in some way, then you create a narrower subcategory. And that from the standpoint of a lot of search tools, this is the function. So yes, on the one hand, that's a Boolean thing, and you know, it ties into the way that we can use metadata fields, and we all get excited about that in libraries. But this is superficially simple and actually complex, and I want to linger a little bit on that complexity. So to go back now to Andrew Large's idea, that this black box mentality, as he saw it, was sort of unlikely. And now, of course, we know it's the opposite. This is our default way of gathering information from our students. There is this model that you take your keywords, you put them into the black box, and the truth is what is out, it just comes out. And this leads to all sorts of things. I think among academics, it's not as typical for that to lead to a lack of awareness of the actual individual sources of information. But for students, it is, right? And this is especially problematic when you have a decreasing return on keyword search. So here's a better version of the black box quotation that I'm referring to from Andrew Large's work. But you know, when the keywords that I'm using have a complex psychological background, and I'm unsure of what to be putting in the first place, or I'm using euphemisms, or I'm not thinking at all about the tool that is actually bringing me back those results, it's really questionable, of course, the quality of the truth that I'm getting. And for discovery layers, we are emulating a lot of that. So the real question is, and this is an old question, it's an old question. I will return to that Google and discovery layer comparison slide if I need to, but there's not a lot of information there. It's really just sort of a framing bit. But you know, the idea of how and whether discovery layers are good for teaching and learning is not new or even really settled, but one thing that is increasingly true is that discovery layers are an expected aspect of a library's arsenal from a faculty and from a student perspective. And I collected a few quotes and paraphrases here that kind of frame some of that development. I'm not going to linger too much on the individual citations. I'll put them up more for reference for the things that I'm saying. You know, but if you look at the history of the way that discovery layers have been discussed, it's kind of a mix of, you know, students don't use advanced search even though it's there. And of course, in the earlier days of discovery layers, a lot of the discussion was about how well they worked in the first place. And, you know, it's interesting that one consistent theme throughout the, I guess, what would you say, decade and a half that discovery layers have really become commonplace is that it's user expectations that frequently are the most inspiring on the one hand in terms of developing these tools and making them more useful, but at the same time that kind of get in the way of the use. So another study that uses the idea of black boxes as a metaphor for the way that students think about specifically gathering music resources. This is Kirsten Duggan's study. She did her own study with her own students and noted that, yeah, this is, there's very little thought given to the tool itself that's being used. It's more, I see the keyword box and I expect that it's going to function in a certain way. And so this idea of how discovery layers interact with learning in general is, I'm not making a specific argument for one way or the other, but in terms of being able to tie into what students actually expect and work with that, I found them to be invaluable. And the same thing is true, as I think a lot of those studies noted as well, that usage of resources increases to such a degree that
Patrick, that's your 5-minute mark.
Okay, thank you, that they become indispensable. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm gonna move ahead as quickly as I can. The way that we search in discovery layers is by definition different, of course, than the way that we search through other kinds of databases. And I did not appropriately think about the way that this would influence my interactions in the classroom with students. There was a study that was done contrasting 2 different research styles when it comes to doing English papers in particular, that contrasted build-up and boil-down heuristics, where a build-up style would be doing all my research at once, and then boil-down would be, boil-down would be doing all my research at once and then gradually selecting from it those things that fit into my eventual paper, and build-up being doing different kinds of searches strategically as I moved through my project. And not surprisingly, that build-up approach, where you've got to actually think through the search that you're putting together and connect it to the sources that you're using, is more successful. And so one of the reasons for that is that the advanced search actually scaffolds the way that you think through things. And with the discovery layer, this is possible to a degree that is just not really practical when you've got to go through individual databases. Now, there are exceptions. So our psych students, for example, we spend all of our time using PsycInfo for the most part when I go and meet with upper level classes there. But for most students, time in the discovery layer allows them this space to break down the query, yes, but also then to think about what kind of sources, am I expecting to find for this? Academic articles, do I need a book for this? If I'm looking for a book, how much should I focus on title versus subject? If I'm looking for an article, should I include the abstract? All of these things are pieces of the advanced search. And when you can search across multiple databases, it makes a big difference, particularly for, and here's my example project, a hard to structure search project like the Unfamiliar Genres project. I've got a link here to the LibGuide and some pixelated images. But just to give you a sense for what this was, I worked with this group of students with our discovery layer to come up with very specific and sophisticated searches because they were doing research on specific genres, which sort of presents this very interesting example of an old library problem of how you find, genre information and title information without those things getting mucked up within the context of your search results. And when you do this using a discovery layer because you want to be as inclusive as possible and surface as many things as possible, it presents an interesting context for search. And so I did bring a number of these to work through. I'll give you a flavor of them now in the interest of time. But what I really want to leave you with is, even though I didn't feel great about that session per se, because it had to be so sloggy and slow, and we spent so much time with those queries, I got some really nice comments. This one was typical. And it's not that that's all that unusual. That's not what I'm saying. I get mad compliments all the time. No, I'm kidding. But, it's okay. But the point is, this strategy of using the discovery layer tied into all of these different aspects of what makes the search process worthwhile and interesting, and really provided an interesting space to meet students. So I advocate for creative use of discovery layers, for encouraging students to use the advanced search as a scaffold for their thought, and also to, get yourself in there, be willing to be open to that and indicate that openness, because I think it yields great benefits, probably regardless of your greater context. I think that this is the kind of relationship building fostered through information that we thrive on. So anyhow, I think I made it. I don't think I had to cut out anything too brutally. Thank you for your attention. Oh, there's some works cited for you. Happy to share this presentation if anyone wants it. Although I know that the recording goes up too, so maybe that's an old person thing to say. I don't know. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. That was great. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will get to them at the end of both presentations. So next up, we have Sarah Waits. She's going to be discussing accessing ancestors, finding enslaved people in Sacramental records. And Sarah is a native New Orleanian who has worked in the Office of Archives and Records at the Archdiocese of New Orleans for the past 2 years. Prior to the Archdiocese, she worked at the Amistad Research Center and the National World War II Museum. She received a certificate in archival studies from LSU's School of Information Studies and her master's degree in history from the University of New Orleans and a bachelor's in history and in creative writing from Louisiana State University. In addition to her position as research archivist at the Archdiocese, Sarah is a licensed tour guide and enjoys leading walking tours in the French Quarter, and she is currently the president of the Greater New Orleans Archivists Organization. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sarah now.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks Patrick for your presentation. That was very interesting, and I think it kind of works well. You were talking about searches and search queries, and that's kind of the root of the discussion that I'm going to be doing as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's go ahead and get this up. Okay, can everybody see it? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my title is Accessing Ancestors, Finding Enslaved People in Sacramental Records. So working at the Archdiocese, we get in a lot of genealogy queries, people looking for sacramental records like baptisms, marriages, funerals, burials, trying to find out information either for their own ancestors or just kind of, historical figures. And a lot of times, it can be really difficult to find records for people who were enslaved. As far as publicly available records, a lot of people can find ancestors on the 1870 census, but getting beyond 1870 and back into the earlier part of the 19th century can be really difficult. So the purpose of my discussion is sort of how to take those publicly available databases and find information and then sort of narrow it down so that you could submit a genealogy request to the Archdiocese and try and find records of people within the sacramental records. So the Archdiocese of New Orleans is sort of the Catholic governing body for the state of Louisiana. So within the Archdiocese, it encompasses 9 civil parishes. So any Catholic church that falls within one of those parishes, a lot of their historic records end up at the archives office. So of course we have Orleans and Jefferson, Plaquemines, a couple of parishes on the North Shore, and then also the river parishes. So throughout all of that physical area, we have more than 130 churches in our collection, We have 6 cemeteries and the corresponding burial registries, and our collection spans over 300 years. So really starting from when the first Europeans came to New Orleans in the early 1700s, all the way up until the present day. So the Office of Archives and Records at the Archdiocese is responsible for storing, maintaining, and providing access to all institutional material, including sacramental records, correspondence, parish histories, school records, religious orders, and organizations from 1720 to the present. So in addition to our sacramental records, and you can see this picture here, these are all books from St. Louis Cathedral. We also have correspondence from bishops and archbishops. So just a wealth of information for people doing all sorts of different types of research. So my kind of case study is one man. He was, according to the 1900 census, a Black man born around 1858. His name was Albert Oscar Epps. And so to just get some information about him, if I know he was born in 1858, that's what Family Search is telling me. That means he was born before the Civil War. It's possible that his ancestors were enslaved. There's a lot of information that I'd like to find out about this person. I know nothing. So how can I find something out about him? So when I do any genealogy research, I always start with Family Search. It is a free web application. You can create a login, and basically anything that you could access through Ancestry, you can pretty much access through Family Search, and you don't have to pay for it. The New Orleans Public Library also has some really great resources, and I have links to both of those websites up here. And so really to do any research, I always start with some of these sources, try and get some information. So you can see I have my screenshot from Family Search. I have Albert Oscar, last name Epps, New Orleans, 1900. Let's see what shows up. So in the results, I have quite a few entries for Albert, Albert Oscar, Oscar Albert. I'm getting some hits as far as parents' names, death information, residence, some good census information. It looks like I have his spouse's maiden name. And so now I have some key elements. If this is correct, I now know that Albert Oscar Epps, his parents are Justine Pierre and William Epps. So if I can start looking into earlier census records and see if Albert shows up with these people, how far back can we get just by looking at Family Search? So this is the 1900 census. This is one of my favorite censuses because it has some really amazing information. So you can see I left the top of the census and then I kind of cut out the parts for people that we didn't need so that we could actually focus on Albert. So we not only have, of course, the state of Louisiana, the county or parish of Orleans. We're in the 11th precinct. This is all really good information as far as trying to drill down like physically where they were living within the city. On the left-hand side, you can see it says St. Anne Street. So we know that being on St. Anne Street, if he's not in the French Quarter, then perhaps he's in the Treme or in, you know, just the neighborhoods right above that. So that does give us a very specific location for Albert. He is listed as being the head of household. His wife, May or Mary's there, and then he has a daughter and 2 sons. It gives us their the sex, the race. It tells us not only how old they are, but when they were born, which is super helpful because now we know that Albert was born, it looks like in November of 1858. We know that he was born in Louisiana. His father was from Virginia and his mother was from Louisiana. So all of that is super helpful as we try to get a little bit further back in time. So searching into the 1870 census, this is 30 years prior, and it looks like we have William Epps. We know that that's Albert's dad, is the head of the household with his wife, Justine, and then Albert and all of his siblings. So we have Emma, Sophie, William, Rachel, and his youngest sister, Eugenie. So this is really helpful because it does confirm that his parents are William and Justine, and we have last name Epps. So all of this is really good. So we're at the 1870 census. We know from previous searches that Albert was born before the Civil War. This census says that he's 11, so that at least puts him in 1859. The other census said 1858. So how do we get Albert prior to the Civil War? That's our real question here. So in all of these searches, I also came across a marriage record on Family Search for William Epps and Justine Pierre. So 1872, this is 2 years after the 1870 marriage. They've obviously been together a long time. They have a number of children, and they decide in 1872 to make their relationship, legal in the eyes of the estate. So what's really great here is that now we have information about William Epps, how old he is in 1872, how old Justine is in 1872, the name of William's parents, and the fact that he was born in Virginia. And then we have Justine, who was 45 in 1872. She's born in Louisiana, and she's the daughter of Pierre and Sophie. So this is super helpful. We have some very important bits of information that will help us get into the past a little more clearly. So if I take this information to Family Search, I'm looking for Justine Pierre, possible other last name Epps, New Orleans, and I'm looking for a specific year. Let's say I look for 1860, 1870, but you can see in the results, as far as civic records, the only place that she's showing up is in the census from 1870, 1880, 1900, and then we have some residence locations from city directories. So this is not exactly giving me the information that I'm looking for, because I'm really trying to find Justine prior to 1870. So in another search, I find her on the 1860 census. So I see Justine Lewis, Justine Grima. That doesn't really fit because that's not a last name that we've seen. However, the birth makes sense, 1825. That pretty much lines up with the other information that we've had her. The location, New Orleans, that makes sense. So if we were to click on that, would it be helpful? So in the 1860 census, Justine and her children, these names that we've recognized because we've seen them together before, are showing up as free people within the household of Felix Grima Sr. So this is really interesting. This is 1860, 1 year before the Civil War has started, and Justine is showing up on the 1860 census, which only recorded people who were listed as free. So in 1860, Justine is free, as are, it looks like, 5 of her children, and she's living within the household of Felix Grima Sr. and his family. So that is really neat to find out that she was, at least in 1860, listed as a free woman. And there we have Albert, 2 years old. I had kind of, you have the census in the background, and then I've sort of pulled out a bit so you can see it a little bit better. Justine is 35. She's female, and she's listed as a mulatto. And so are all of her children. So within the census, under the race category, you would typically have Black, white, mulatto, sometimes Native American. It just sort of depended on who the census taker was. So if we pull it up even closer, we can see Justine, 35, Albert 2. And under Albert, there's another woman listed, also a mulatto named Catherine, who it looks like she is maybe 65. So obviously within the Grima household, in addition to the white family, there are a number of free people of color living on the property as well. So with this information, we have a first name, a last name, a rough date of birth. We can go ahead and request a genealogy search within the Archdiocese of New Orleans Archives genealogy request. So The reason I like to really narrow down requests to get the most specific information is that you're more likely to yield positive results if you can give a specific year, a location, a name. The way the sacramental records are organized, especially for the 19th century, is that the books are segregated by race. So there's a section of baptism, marriage, and funeral books for people who were considered white, and then also baptism, marriage, and funeral for people who were considered enslaved or free people of color. And in a lot of cases, the records of people who were enslaved, they're not indexed the same way as with the white people. So they're actually indexed by the name of their enslaver. Now, since we know that Albert was born in 1858, and it looks like his mother was free, he will probably have a sacramental record with a surname of either his mother or his father. That matters because with records of enslaved people, they weren't given a surname, so they're identified by the surname of their enslaver. So if I was going to make this request, I'm going to be looking for a baptism. In addition to knowing 1858, in 1900, Albert said that he was born in November. So I can say November of 1858 for a birth date. A lot of times in the earlier records, you do have people baptized pretty close to their birth, so more of an infant baptism, but not always. Sometimes they might be over a year old by the time they get baptized. So it's good to know when to start looking, and then to know that you might have to be looking for, through the next year or two to actually find the person that you're looking for. Now, our request also asks you where the sacrament occurred. If we know that the Grima residence is in the French Quarter, and it actually is today a historic house museum located on St. Louis Street, then I know that the Grimas and the Epps, Justine and her family, are living in the French Quarter. And so it's likely that they're getting their sacraments at St. Louis Cathedral because that's the closest church. If I wasn't successful looking there, I might want to check out St. Mary's on Charters, another church within the French Quarter, or possibly St. Augustine in the Tremaine neighborhood. So success, Albert Oscar, this is his baptism record from St. Louis Cathedral. Now he is listed with his first name, middle name, and last name of Epps. That pretty much means that he was considered legitimate, even though we know his parents were not married until 1872. This record is in French. Most of our sacramental records are, especially in the 19th century, either in French or Spanish for the cathedral, depending on the culture of people at different churches. For example, in German parishes, the records are in German. Sometimes priests would record the records in Latin. We do have records in Italian as well. It really just depends on kind of how we say like a national parish as far as, what language was the priest's first language. And then a lot of times that's how the sacramental records are recorded. So in this case, the record is in French, and it says that Albert Oscar, born the 29th of October, 1858, son of William Epps and Justine Lefebvre, baptized the 10th of April, 1859 at St. Louis Cathedral. So this is just really amazing. It confirms the information that we found on the census. We actually know that he was born at the very end of October. And then, of course, both of his parents are listed as well as godparents. So it's really awesome that we were successful and we found a baptism record for Albert Oscar. And it looks like because both of his parents are listed, he has a last name, he was born free in 1858. So there's no information about an enslaver or that he's enslaved. So this is really amazing that we have Albert Oscar Epps born free before the Civil War in 1858. So let's say I now have Albert pretty much figured out and I want to drill into Justine. I want to find more information about her. So according to the 1860 census, she's 35. In the 1870 census, she's 46. So that means her birth date is somewhere around 1824 or 1825. So if I was going to submit a sacramental records research request for someone named Justine, I'm going to presume because she was in the Grima household, maybe she was born free, but in any case, the Grima last name is probably going to be associated with her record. And then I know that she's born around 1824 or 25. Since I know that she's probably with the Grimas, I'm also going to be doing a search at St. Louis Cathedral. So I have the type of record, the year, the name of the person, a possible surname to search under, and then also a location of a church parish. So this is a record that I found that fit with most of those elements. So this is a record of an enslaved child, Maria. It says that she's a mulata esclava of Madame Berth, or Bartholomew was his name, but Madame Berth Grima. So Madame Veuve, meaning that she was the widow of Bert Grima. This record is for someone who was born in October of 1825 to Sophia and baptized the 13th of November, 1825. So is this Justine? The mother's name is correct. According to the marriage record that we had for Justine, her mother's name was Sophie. And of course, Sophie, Sophia, very similar. The enslaver's name is correct. We know that Justine is related to the Grimas in some way, and here it shows that her mother was enslaved by the widow Grima. And the birth date matches, this being the end of 1825, that matches up with the census information that we found through family search. Within the Sacramental records, there's a real prevalence of the name Marie or Maria. It was common for many, many, many little girls being baptized to be known as, Marie Justine, Maria Magdalena, Maria Philomen. So it was sort of like everybody's first name was Mary, Marie, Maria, and then you often went by your second name. So, I can't say for sure that this is actually a sacramental record for Justine, but all the other elements besides her name match up. So it feels, maybe like 90%. I would certainly hold on to this and think that it does provide a lot of the information that I'm looking for. So now that I have Justine and I have some other information, and we know her mother. So if I wanted to find out anything about Sophie, how would I do it? So my search terms, I have Sophie, last name Grima, because we know that's the name of her enslaver. If Justine was born in 1825, let's say her mother was anywhere between 20 and 30, I put in for the search year range 1805. That seemed pretty safe. So the first result that I got was for someone named Sophie Grima, saying that she died 6 April 1849. The record is a cemetery record from Louisiana. So all of those things match up. She's dying after 1825, so after her daughter is born. That all makes sense. What I think is particularly interesting about this search result is that directly below Sophie Grima, you can see it says Marie Sophie Adelaide Grima. This is Felix Grima's wife. So Felix Grima, enslaver, his wife, Marie Sophie Adelaide Grima. So you can see her name, Marie Sophie Adelaide Grima. She went by Adelaide. So a lot of times, women have a lot of names, and there's one name that sort of is the name that they use within, for friends and family. So if we were to go ahead and click on that Sophie Grima death, 6th April, 1849, what are we going to find? So this is a card that basically says Sophie, slave of Madame Grima, died April 6, 1849, and looks like she was buried in St. Louis Cemetery number 2. So if I was going to take this information and look for anything within the Sacramental records, I would be looking for Sophie, last name, surname Grima, because that's her enslaver, a death date of 1849, specifically April of 1849. I'm going to search in the St. Louis Cemetery number 2 burial records. And we also have St. Louis Cathedral funeral expenses. So we don't always have a complete funeral record of everyone buried, but basically if you were buried within one of the cemeteries and you paid for a tomb or a grave, it might show up in this other set of books. So I have 2 places where I can search for her. So results. This is a funeral expense record for an enslaved woman named Sophie. She was enslaved by Madame Grima. It says that she was born in New Orleans, that the names of her parents are unknown. She died, it says, yesterday night at 6.5 hours at the age of 60 years old. She was living on St. Louis between Bourbon and Dauphine, and we know that that's where the Grima residence was. Her interment was paid for by Mr. Felix Grima, and it was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in cemetery number 2. It then tells us the cost of the interment. And what's amazing is that we have the physical location of the tomb within St. Louis cemetery number 2. So it says at the tomb, or you can see in parentheses, it says 4, that means oven, so it's a wall vault. It's in the second range, number 65, to the left of the main entrance, parallel to the Rue Robertson, between Bienville and Douane, which is Iberville, cemetery number 2. So St. Louis cemetery number 2 is separated into 3 city blocks, 3 squares. And so it's telling us that this is the square that's bounded by Iberville and Bienville. And so that's actually square number 3 of St. Louis cemetery number 2. So all of the information within this record is just amazing. It's letting us know that Sophie was 60 when she died in 1849. That means she was born in 1789. She was born in New Orleans. It's possible that she was born enslaved to the Grimas. So we now have gotten ourselves back into the 18th century by finding information at this record.
All right, and 5 minutes, Sarah.
Perfect. I'm almost done. So another database that I love is the New Orleans Cemetery Database. This is a combination of efforts from the Historic New Orleans Collection and the New Orleans Catholic Cemeteries Office. And so they compiled all of this information from a survey they did back in the 1970s and 1980s, where they physically took pictures of every single grave in St. Louis number 1 and number 2. So you can search by a grave location. If you happen to know a tomb number, you can search by the last name of someone. For the most part, it's just information that is on the exterior tablet. So if a tablet has broken or been displaced, you may not have that information through this database, but it is a really great starting point. So I did a search for EPS just to see what would happen. And now we have a hit. So St. Louis 2, it's a wall vault along the Robertson side, number 65. And that all matches up with Sophie. So we know that if Sophie was buried in this wall vault in 1849, and then basically her son-in-law, her daughter Justine's husband, William Epps, is buried there in 1882. And it's his name on the exterior tablet that describes the tomb. So what we also have in the archive, which is a wonderful resource, is the titles for the cemeteries. So some of the original title documents. So this one's kind of hard to see, but basically you can see over on the left-hand side, it says 65. Below that, it says Grima. And below that, it says Sophie 1849. And then it has a list of all the people buried within the tomb. And so the burials include William, Justine, Marie Emma, William Jr., and Albert Oscar. So here we have kind of the whole family here. Albert Oscar was buried in September of 1904. We know that the tomb started with Sophie buried in 1849. I had a chance to go to the cemetery in just a few months ago, and I was able to check out, get a picture of the wall vault. So right there, right in the middle, that bright white one is the Epps tomb, number 65. You can kind of see the name William Epps with a little cross above it. And so this is where all the Eppses are. So from starting with one person in 1900, we were actually able to go back quite a few generations. We have Albert Oscar from 1858 to 1904, Justine with last name varying Pierre Lefebvre and Epps, 1825 to 1889, and then Sophie or Sophia roughly 1789 to 1849. And that's it. I put on here my email. If anybody is doing any kind of research and has questions, you're welcome to reach out. And, this is sort of the type of research work that I do a lot of at the Archdiocese. So I'm always happy to answer questions and hopefully get, more people interested in doing genealogy research.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really incredible. If anybody has any questions, feel free to go ahead and drop them into the chat box, and Roxanne will be moderating for them.
That was really great. And Sarah, I really love whenever people show their workflows. So that was really to see. I have a question that kind of is related to both of you guys' presentations. Sarah, whenever you have patrons come that have used Family Search to kind of do their initial searches, do you find that they're able to come to the information on their own? Like, are they having success in using Family Search's user interface?
I think so. So the reason I like to sort of narrow it down a lot is because our research request, there is a charge for it. So I really want to make sure that people are going to be able to be successful when they're looking for things specifically. So a lot of times we get people who've done a lot of work through Family Search, and they're looking for that one key that maybe connects like their first, the first ancestor in New Orleans. A lot of times we have people from all over the country. They say, I know great grandpa came over on a boat from Italy, and I'm pretty sure he went to New Orleans first. Now we live in Cleveland. And so they're always trying to find that record of that first person. And what I found actually the last few years, a lot of people are trying to get dual citizenship with Italy. And so they have to kind of have that first connect. So either looking for ancestors who got married, the first person who was baptized, and then they take that certified record and they can submit it to the consulate with, I guess, other identifying paperwork, and they can prove their identity that way. And then, yeah, I do find people who, they know somebody from 1880, and it might be a thing where it's like, well, we know that they were enslaved in St. John the Baptist Parish. So what do we do now? And that's where I find it really helpful to kind of do that family search, get back to a certain time period, try and confirm names, dates, where parents were born, maybe get a little bit more specific with possibly what plantation within which parish. Do they know the enslaver? Was the enslaver even Catholic? Because we've had quite a few where actually the enslaver had a very, northern name, Williamson or something, and they never show up in any of the sacramental records. And if the enslaver wasn't Catholic, they probably didn't see the purpose of getting any of their enslaved people baptized. Whereas with the Catholics, everybody got baptized, the whole, enslavers family, as well as everybody born on the plantation. Even when they would purchase someone at a slave auction, they would go take that person to the church and get them baptized. And so you do have this paper trail that's, incredible for, records prior to the Civil War.
Thank you so much. Patrick, in your experience, do you feel like the prevalence of Google complicates trying to teach students how to use discovery layers? And do you feel like people have come into contact with that a lot before they get to a university library?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's, I guess, yeah, on the big answer is yes, it complicates it, and it's basically Google, but I feel like it's what I notice more than I used to notice is a lack of awareness of Google as the environment. Like, it's not a thing that they interact with. It's sort of, it's the entirety of the experience, to the point where you have to kind of remind people that, oh yeah, Google is like a thing that I use. So, and I think that's where the difficulty comes in, because it's interesting to watch, particularly college age students, struggle with the idea of what they're looking at on a screen corresponding to a particular document type, or that there are different document types, or that the way that a certain kind of source comes into being matters. So the development of a book is different than the development of a brief news article, is different than the development of an academic journal piece. And it's increasingly difficult to get to that point. And I think that that's the stickiest part for me as a practitioner, is that there's more of a distance to bridge. At least it seems to be the case, that I'd need to do like a bi-level staging before I can get to, say, source type conversation a little bit. And I think part of that is because of the unquestioned ubiquity of the tool. It's easy to talk about Googling as a verb, haha, whatever. And I know that that's old, but it's really true. And I'm not, I think that there's possibility there. And there's also a little bit of peril. So anyway.
Thank you. And we don't have any other questions unless anybody has anything that they would like to ask.
Yeah, I see this one in the chat. Does the Archdiocese maintain records from schools? We do. So if a school has closed, the Office of Schools will send those records over to us. So, you know, we have a lot of Catholic schools, elementary schools and things that are not open anymore. And so we have their records, but for any of the schools that are still open, then they're kind of responsible for all of their records, historic and current.
All right, well, thanks for the questions. Does anybody have any last minute questions before we sign off for the day? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.